Chapter 1. The Scent of Salt and Struggle. The Sea of Galilee was not merely a body of water to Simon. It was a harsh, unpredictable master. It gave life, and it took it away. On this particular morning, the sky was painted in the bruised hues of dawn, deep purples and sullen grays. The air was thick with a familiar, pungent scent of salt, algae, and the metallic tang of empty nets. Simon, his hands heavily calloused and cracked from years of pulling coarse hemp ropes, sat in the hull of his wooden fishing boat. Beside him, his brother Andrew worked in exhausted silence. They were meticulously picking seaweed and debris from the meshes of their dragnets. It had been a long, agonizingly fruitless night. Hours of casting into the dark, silent depths had yielded absolutely nothing. The fish had seemingly vanished, leaving only the biting wind and the heavy weight of impending debt. The Roman taxes did not care if the fish were biting. The tax collectors demanded their share regardless. Across the beach, the sons of Zebedee, James and John, were in a similar state of weary resignation, sitting with their father in their boat, mending torn nets. The entire fishing community of Capernaum felt the heavy sigh of the morning. It was a life of grueling repetition: sleep, mend, row, cast, haul, and pray for enough silver denarii to survive another week. Simon wiped a mixture of sea spray and sweat from his brow. His bones ached. He looked out at the horizon, wondering how many more nights of empty darkness his spirit could endure. He was a man of the earth and water, practical and cynical, yet deep within him was a quiet, desperate yearning for something more, a whisper of the Messiah that the prophets of old had promised. Chapter 2. The Crowds and the Carpenter. As the sun crested the eastern hills, bringing a warm, golden light to the water's surface, the quiet rhythm of the morning was broken. A low hum of voices began to drift down from the town. It wasn't the usual haggling of fish merchants. It was a collective murmur of awe, anticipation, and urgency. A crowd was approaching the shoreline. At the center of the surging mass of people was a single figure. Simon paused his mending, his eyes narrowing against the morning glare. He had heard of this man, Jesus of Nazareth, a carpenter turned itinerant rabbi, a healer who spoke with an authority that terrified the Pharisees and captivated the common folk. Rumors of his miracles had swept through the Galilean countryside like a wildfire. The crowd was pressing intensely upon Jesus, hungry for his words, desperate for a healing touch. The shoreline, narrow and rocky, left Jesus with little room to stand without being pushed into the surf. Jesus turned, and his eyes met Simon's. The gaze was piercing, yet incredibly calm. It was a look that seemed to bypass the dirt, the exhaustion, and the gruff exterior of the fisherman, reaching straight into the marrow of his soul. "Simon," Jesus called out, his voice cutting clearly through the noise of the crowd. "May I use your boat?" Simon hesitated. He was bone-tired, hungry, and frustrated by the night's failure. The last thing he wanted was to row back out, even just a few yards, to serve as a floating pulpit. But there was something undeniably compelling about the Nazarene. With a weary sigh, Simon nodded, pushing the heavy wooden hull slightly off the sand. Jesus stepped aboard. "Put out a little from the land," Jesus requested. Andrew took the oars, and they drifted a short distance from the shore. The water acted as a natural acoustic amplifier. Jesus sat down in the boat, the traditional posture of a rabbi teaching, and began to speak to the multitudes on the beach. Chapter 3. The Echo of Truth. For the next hour, Simon sat silently in the stern listening. He had heard many rabbis in the synagogues, men who read the Torah with rigid, lifeless precision. But this was different. Jesus spoke of a kingdom not built with swords or stone, but of the heart. He spoke of love that defied logic, of grace for the broken, and of a Father in heaven who sought out the lost sheep. His parables were drawn from the dirt of the fields, the seeds of the sower, and the very water they floated upon. Simon found his own cynicism melting away. The heavy burden of his daily survival seemed, for a fleeting moment, to shrink in the vast, warm light of the rabbi's words. He realized he was no longer thinking about his empty nets, the Roman taxes, or his aching back. He was completely captivated. When Jesus finally finished his teaching, a profound silence fell over the shoreline, save for the gentle lapping of the waves against the wooden hull. The crowd stood transfixed. Jesus turned away from the shore and looked directly at Simon. Chapter 4. Into the Deep. Put out into the deep water, Jesus said quietly, but with absolute authority, and let down the nets for a catch. Simon blinked, abruptly pulled back into his reality as a professional fisherman. The command made no sense. He looked at Jesus, a mix of respect and professional irritation battling within him. "Master," Simon began, his voice raspy from the salt air, "we have toiled all night and caught absolutely nothing." He wanted to explain the mechanics of the sea to the carpenter. He wanted to say that fish feed near the surface in the cool of the night and retreat to the unreachable depths during the blinding heat of the day. He wanted to show him the painstakingly cleaned and folded nets, ready for the next night's attempt. But as Simon looked into Jesus' eyes, the arguments died on his tongue. The authority he had felt in the rabbi's teaching was now directed entirely at him. It was an invitation disguised as a command. "But at your word," Simon swallowed his pride, "I will let down the nets." He signaled to Andrew. With heavy, reluctant strokes, they rowed the boat out toward the deep, blue center of the lake. The sun was fully up now, beating down upon their shoulders. "Here," Simon muttered, tossing the heavy, weighted edge of the dragnet over the side. The coarse rope slipped through his raw palms. He watched the net sink into the dark water, expecting the familiar, disappointing slackness. Suddenly, the rope jerked violently. Simon was thrown forward, nearly pitching over the side of the hull. The rope tore through his hands, burning his skin. The boat tilted sharply. "Andrew, grab the line." Simon roared, his fatigue instantly evaporating, replaced by raw adrenaline. They both hauled on the thick hemp, planting their feet against the wooden ribs of the boat. The weight was impossible. Beneath the surface, the water boiled in a frenzy of silver scales. The net was not just full, it was overflowing. The sheer mass of the fish was threatening to drag them under. Snap! The terrifying sound of breaking hemp echoed in the air. The net was beginning to tear under the unimaginable strain. "James! John!" Simon bellowed across the water, waving frantically toward the distant shore. "Bring the other boat. Now!" The sons of Zebedee rowed furiously toward them. When they arrived, it took all four men, straining with every ounce of their strength, to drag the chaotic, thrashing mass of fish over the gunwales. First Simon's boat, then the boat of James and John, filled to the absolute brim. The boats sat so low in the water that the waves began to lap over the sides. They were sinking from the weight of the blessing. Chapter 5. The Realization. The frenzy subsided, replaced by the heavy panting of the four fishermen. The bottoms of both boats were entirely hidden beneath a shimmering, suffocating mountain of fish. It was a catch that would feed their families for months, a catch that defied every law of nature and logic they knew. Simon did not look at the fish. He looked at Jesus. The rabbi was sitting calmly in the stern, perfectly balanced despite the heavily listing boat, watching Simon with a gentle, knowing expression. A sudden, overwhelming terror seized Simon. It was not the fear of the storm or the fear of drowning. It was the absolute, crushing realization of his own profound unworthiness in the presence of the divine. The veil of the ordinary had been torn away, and Simon suddenly saw himself clearly, a flawed, quick-tempered, sinful man standing before perfect holiness. His legs gave out. Ignoring the thrashing fish beneath him, Simon collapsed, falling to his knees at Jesus' feet. "Depart from me," Simon wept, his voice cracking, his face buried in his hands. "For I am a sinful man, O Lord." He expected rejection. He expected the holy rabbi to step away in disgust. Instead, he felt a warm, strong hand rest gently on his trembling shoulder. "Do not be afraid," Jesus said. His voice was no longer the loud, projecting tone used for the crowds. It was intimate, quiet, and infinitely compassionate. "From now on, you will be catching men." Chapter 6. Leaving the nets behind. They rowed back to the shore in a heavy, awestruck silence. The beach was still lined with people, now gasping and pointing at the impossibly overloaded boats. By all worldly measures, Simon, Andrew, James, and John had just secured the greatest financial triumph of their lives. They had hit the fisherman's lottery. The boats scraped against the sand. Zebedee, James and John's father, waded into the surf, his eyes wide with astonishment at the bounty. Jesus stepped out of the boat onto the dry land. He did not ask for a share of the catch. He did not linger to bask in the admiration of the crowd. He simply turned and began to walk up the shoreline, his path leading away from the sea, away from the familiar, and into the unknown. He glanced back over his shoulder. He did not say a word, but his eyes issued the final, silent invitation. "Follow me." Simon looked at the boat. He looked at the massive pile of silver fish, his livelihood, his security, his identity. He looked at his calloused hands. Then he looked at the retreating figure of the Nazarene. In a moment that defied all human logic, the great catch no longer mattered. The fish, the boats, the debts, the sea itself, it all seemed incredibly small compared to the magnitude of the man walking away. Simon dropped the thick hemp rope onto the wet sand. He didn't secure the boat. He didn't count the fish. He stepped out of the water. Beside him, Andrew did the same. Without a word of hesitation, they began to walk after Jesus. A few paces behind them, James and John exchanged a look. They looked at their father, Zebedee, who sat in the boat among the hired men, watching his sons with a mixture of confusion and sudden understanding. James and John laid down their mending needles. They stepped over the gunwales and joined Simon and Andrew. They left everything. They left the nets that had bound them to a life of survival. They left the security of the known for the perilous, glorious uncertainty of the kingdom. The sun rose higher, casting long shadows behind them as the four fishermen followed the carpenter away from the sea, taking their first steps on a journey that would inevitably change the course of human history. The weight of the ordinary was gone, replaced by the boundless freedom of the call.